something odd about this one.
The B-52 bomber has returned with the Seething Bazelgeuse. The Seething Bazelgeuse is actually really fun monster to go about. I didn't think I was gonna have this much fun actually hunting this thing as I actually had. Simply for the fact that I've basically never hunted this thing like at all. I barely hunted anything about it. So the fact I'm having fun finding a Seething Bazelgeuse is completely not alienating to me, but it's so strange. I would never think I'd be having this much affinity. And that comes with all of the issue that I have with the original Bazelgeuse, where a lot of the time you feel like the scale will just drop randomly on you and giving you absolute hell. Maybe it's because of the fact that I'm not playing Longsword, so I don't drip scales as much or something like this. But overall, I will say that I had a lot of more positive experience finding the Seething Bazelgeuse than I did the regular. And although whether I win this fight or successfully hunt him or not, to me doesn't really matter as much as I'm having a lot better of a comprehension against the monsters. So let's look really fast at how the Bazelgeuse was, the Seething Bazelgeuse is different than the usual. First of all, the scale dropping shenanigans galore have been up to 1,000 with the Seething Bazelgeuse. Every time he swings his down, he has his scales on. He will drop scales pretty far away, making range user fairly weak in this scenario. The scales on his chest are also really hard to deal with if he ever does like a chest move like this and he flings his chest and his head forward. It will swing more scales, making it more dangerous. And there's a lot of scenarios here where it will drop scales without precaution, without activation, without prediction, and you will simply die from it. With that said, the main moves that you will see that are different are the fact... there we go. That's just random explosion number one. The main thing that you will see that is different is from his super move, since most Master Rank monster have pretty much what I call a master move, or a super move, depending on how you want to say it. And by the way, random bump shenanigans number 2. So pretty much every end game monster in Iceborne have as what I call pretty much a master move, and the move for the B-52 himself is essentially just suicide bombing the shit out of the ground, which is even better than what's in original, although it still has the back and forward move. I would not recommend going against the Seething Bazelgeuse with a ranged weapon, if only because his bombs are usually shoot out pretty far. If you're a melee user, you don't have to worry about bomb drops from his attacks from like his tail swap and like chest forward, as much as you do about just random drops in general. While if you're a ranged user, his pounce attack that can lead into very long range bomb drops are usually what makes or breaks the fight, if I were to be completely honest. With that said, there's something that I've learned about the Seething Bazelgeuse that I didn't about the Bazelgeuse, and I don't know why it took me this long to understand about it, or maybe it's just that it's a lot more easier to read about the Seething Bazelgeuse, is that you need to read and understand the status of the bombs. If they are glowing, that means that they're about to drop, they're gonna hot drop on your ass as soon as the Seething doesn't move. If they are all glowing together and you see his chest pumping up and his tails light up, that means that he's in range. And if you see the scales blue, you better be a god at positioning yourself correctly if y'all don't want to die. I'm just saying. So as soon as you see the Bazel light up like this, it usually means that his fire breath attack are gonna be popping off. Like his glands are gonna be a lot more devastating. The bombs can drop at any time and light up instantly, despite the fact that they're lit up or not. So reading the status of the Seething becomes a lot more apparent, and I believe more than other monsters. And it's not something like the Mojang, for example, where like, oh, he's Super Saiyan and he's not Super Saiyan. It's a lot, I don't want to say subtle, because it's quite obvious, but it's still something where you're like, oh, okay, it's a clear thing, but reading the body parts and targeting the right portion of the body is also a lot more an efficient way of fighting this thing to begin with. His tail swap is usually a really easy opening to go under him and attack the chest, so if you have a high reaching weapon such as the switch axe or the longsword punishing the The body is usually pretty good, as well as the head, although you shouldn't go that much for the head. You should obviously go for the chest and or the body in these kinds of scenarios. It pretty much is the same thing, and you can be in a lot more of a comfortable scenario. The tail swap's usually a good punish. The chest is, please stay behind the hind legs when he's doing the chest forward thing. It's usually your best bet at it. Wall banging him, just staying as much as you have medium range as possible. Probably the best way to go about it in general. The tail, I don't like going for the tail and Seething Bazelgeuse or the Bazelgeuse in general. But if there's ever like a hot spot where you should be aiming at if you have cutting damage, it's usually there. Actually, let's pull up the map right about now, okay? So here's the head zone chart. The reason why I'm saying don't go for the heads is the head is the same as the body, and the body is a better positioning tool in general, and while it's just as dangerous as the head, most likely you have more ways to attack it from many more angles, which is why I say go for the body instead of the legs, since you can also stay on basically below the chest, right between the two hind legs, and you can deal significant amount of damage there, which is why I'm saying that. So average of 43, which is pretty good. This chart's pretty simple: head 45, body 45, back 30, leg 35, wings 35, and tail 65. Which I really like about the Seething Bazelgeuse in general is that every possible scenario is a surefire hit. Like, you'll never get a scenario here while fighting the Bazelgeuse where like, oh, I'm not doing good damage. And I love monsters that don't heavy punishes a body part that you hit. I really, really like this. I really, really do. A lot of monsters will have like a lot of hit zone value where like, oh, 25, 20, and you're like, And especially of later game monsters, so we're talking Gorathian, we're talking Servant Rathalos, we're talking Young Garuga, have a lot of body parts that you need to be super specific about hitting if you want to actually deal damage and not bounce off of. And despite the Seething Bazelgeuse being a tier 3 monster in the books for Iceborne, it's surprising how much they give you leeway in actually fighting this thing and giving you like juicy hit zone values in spite of that, so I really like it. If you're gonna go in with a weapon, an elemental weapon, bring ice. It's a surefire way of dealing the most amount of damage, as most Iceborne monsters are either weak to fire and or ice. Usually, if they're not an ice monster, they're usually weak to fire. They're usually weak to ice, sorry. So, having a great fire weapon is pretty mandatory. Having a great ice weapon is pretty mandatory here, especially since you know what? 25 elemental weakness for the head it's pretty good. It's pretty good. And now we come to the second part of the fire where, as you see the the scales on the tail, they're becoming a lot more blue. And what happens is that the bombs get bigger and the explosions far mightier. And the wings can clip you also. The wings have vent boxes, believe it or not. I still can't believe that this is actually a thing. I would not think that finding the Seething Bazelgeuse would have this much trouble actually fighting and going against hitboxes. But I've learned this the hard way during this fight in particular, where I did not know the wings during the slamming attack, the f***ing edge of the wings would have lingering hitboxes. So again, staying right below the hind legs or staying just in between the wing and the chest is usually your best bet. The tail will also be pretty good, but the main reason why I don't like going for the tail as doubly is just because, again, the tails are pretty high. See, you think there I'd be fine. You think I'd be fine in this scenario fighting him like this because you're like, oh, the wing is way above me. I think he's gonna reach me. And you're like, yeah, absolutely. This will not be an issue whatsoever. And then you get reminded that this game just flat out does not care about you and all your feelings and just gives you the boot. So again, be extremely, extremely careful about your positioning in general. Now, during the original Bazelgeuse episode, I did talk a lot about, well, actually, I made quite a bit of a jokes about his theme, and I do love that it makes a return in the Seething Bazelgeuse fight in particular. But there's one thing about the Seething Bazelgeuse, although it is pretty much a straight-up upgrade from the original Bazelgeuse. Like, there's nothing I can say about Seething that's a downgrade from its original design. I think the colors are prettier. I think the fight is more well-paced. I love how it makes you read the status of the scales now. I really like that. But there is one thing that Seething that makes it feel a lot more inferior than the original. And it's sad to say because I really love Seething. But Seething is not an invader. A Seething Bazelgeuse will only appear in the Elder's Recess, unlike its high-rank counterpart that would drop everywhere. And it makes me think of a couple of cases. Is Seething not an invader in Master Rank because of how much people bitched about the original Basil being invading every quest? Because ever since the remove, and what I've talked about much of the community about Seething Bazelgeuse, is that a lot of people feel really, really bad about the fact that they basically removed the invader status from Basil. As much as people got annoyed for Basil invading every single quest and every single expedition back in high rank in the original world, I feel like a lot of people say, oh, why isn't Seething an invader? And you know what? I'm on their camp on that one too. I wish Seething was an invader. If only because of the blue bombs now, the blue scales. My god, that is such a disruptive thing. And like I said, this is something I've also touched in the Bazelgeuse episode 2, where I don't mind a monster being disruptive to the fight. It just makes you go on your tippy toes. And since Basil is an aerial monster, you don't see him coming, making the bombs literally perfect. A perfect disruptance to the fight, and also being able to deal a little bit of damage to the enemy monster. So Basil is disruptive. Deviljho breaks the pacing of the fight in half. Well, Basil just goes about, drops some bombs, deals some damage, and then the other monster usually gets out. The fact of the matter is, Deviljho just grabs... If you're fighting a Fanged Wyvern, the Deviljho grabs the Fanged Wyvern, keeps it in his mouth, and just walks about. And that may just be your target that you don't have access to. Which, it's such a shame that Seething isn't like this, but Savage keeps the status. Because there's nothing in the lore of the Seething that goes against the idea of him being not an invader now. Actually, there's nothing in the original Basil lore entry that gives you the factor that he should be an invader monster, just like the Savage Deviljho or the Ebony Eldorgaron. Although that is something about Master Rank in general where you're like, maybe this monster shouldn't be an invader. Bambaro, as no, I've talked about it. Oh, by the way, this move is awesome. He just suicide bombed the shit out of everything. I'm so glad I got to see the suicide drop in this hunt in particular. But yeah, there's nothing about the Bambaro that should be able to give him the invader status. Same with the Fulgur Agenaf. I don't care that they're nomads. It just doesn't make any sense. It's just like Tigrex. It shows up pretty much everywhere outside of like one region, which I believe is Coral Highlands. So there's a lot of conflicting information here, and it's really sad that Seething isn't part of this group, because I'd be more than happy to give the Fulgur or Bambaro a spot to Seething just to get some more bomb drops on me. Because Fulgur does nothing as an invader. He doesn't invade, he's just there. Same thing with Bambaro. Unlike Bazelgeuse, he's not, well, okay, you know what? I retire what I said. Bambaro's pretty disruptive with its choo-choo train. Which, you know what? We haven't gotten too much of that in this series, and although I'm a little bit sad, I'm kind of happy about it too. Although we did get a couple of Deviljho intervention. Well, that's about it about the Seething Bazelgeuse. Overall, a lot more positive experience finding the Seething than I did with the original Bazel, although I did have a couple of wing clips, so I have to keep that one in the books. Well, everybody, we'll see you all for another hunt